Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brent. I'm the host for Canadians with Disabilities and their Allies. Today we have Cheryl Hardcastle coming on the show. And well, here is Cheryl Hardcastle. I just introduced her when she comes right on here.
Hi, everybody.
Good afternoon, Cheryl. Thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome. It's great to be here with you guys. What I thought we could do today is talk a little bit about the Accessible Canada Act framework as it relates to transportation, federal transportation that's under the Accessible Canada Act through the Canadian Transportation Agency, that's the CTA. And things are starting to unfold because of the Accessible Canada Act. So I was just going to talk a little bit about it and the opportunities for activism and advocacy that can come with it in the next year. I thought that might be interesting for people because the opportunities to provide feedback as these TSPs, they're called, the Transportation Service Providers, as they are developing their accessibility plans, they are required to have a feedback process, and they're also required to have progress reports that include information about the feedback that they received from people with disabilities. So that's going to be very interesting because there will be organizations that will provide feedback, I'm sure, in a more organized manner in terms of advocacy. But it's an opportunity for individuals to provide the feedback as well when the time comes. And it's not a deadline of like next week we're talking. The Accessible Canada Act is called the ACA. And that provides this framework to remove and prevent barriers that fall in the federal jurisdiction. And there are planning and reporting requirements that the ACA sets out. So that means that regulated entities have to prepare and publish accessibility plans every 3 years in consultation with people with disabilities that address their policies and programs and practices and services in relation to identifying and removing these barriers and the prevention of new barriers. And that priority to do that comes from the framework of the Accessible Canada Act, which says we'll be barrier free by 2040. And that's aspirational, right? We want to be barrier free by 2040. So what does that mean for a federal jurisdiction like under the envelope of transportation, okay? That's the CTA, the Canadian Transportation Agency. So what happened is actually at the end of 2021, in December of 2021, the CTA put out their plan on how they're going to address these obligations in the future for these transportation service providers, which would be called TSPs, how they operate under this Accessible Canada Act and how they're required to comply with the provision of the regulations. They have to prepare these reports, and so the guiding regulations on how they're going to do that is an acronym that you'll hear a little bit more hopefully in the news as the mainstream media catches on to the issues. It's the Accessible Transportation Planning and Reporting Regulations, the ATPRR. So what the ATPRR does is it specifies to these transportation service providers the guidance on how they're going to develop these accessibility plans, their feedback processes, and their progress reports. Now
Wow.
gets to that seems very hopeful, right? Now let's be cynical for a minute, because these regulations are being tightened up all the time. So how are we going to know that it's being enforced, right? That's the main thing. How is there going to be independent investigations? Are these companies going to be expected to be on the honor system, if you will? And what happens if they don't comply? Right now, they say there will be fines from $250 to $250,000. There'll be a range of fines if they don't comply. And this is all sort of being rolled out right now. And what would we like to see happen means that we do have to sit and write these submissions of our experiences, right? This feedback process, I think it's really going to be a turning point for people feeling their self-agency when they are trying to advocate for themselves and the broader community of people living with a bunch of different abilities and what they experience.
That is very, very awesome news. And it's, it'll really help so many people that are, traveling around, trains, buses, planes. It doesn't matter what mode of transportation it is, that
Exactly.
the Accessibility Act there's going to be a regulation, right? That's going to state that these companies have to meet that, a certain regulation. In a timely manner.
Yes.
And with the Accessibility Act, with this the new regulations coming in, I was just going to mention it's too bad that the new regulations don't are not coming fast enough for people on income assistance or disability.
Yeah, it's true. We now have these timelines for these plans for transportation, but in terms of addressing the actual financial barriers, we're still really lacking there, not just federally, but provincially as well. The stress level is unreal, and it's hitting everyone in different ways, and it does. It affects health, it affects mental health, it affects everything. And that movement, the things that could be done quickly every day, there is a new choice to not do anything, I think, and that's really frustrating.
Oh, I see Neil's joined in. Hi, Neil.
I don't know how much you want to reiterate, but
I guess you just give Neil a quick overview, and then I'll go over to Auntie Ali, and then I'll go to Alan, just so Neil gets an idea.
Do you want me to give a quick overview again?
Yeah, if you could. Yeah, just to Neil.
Just before you start, Cheryl, I don't know, did Brent give you my comment about, because you said all these reforms about the transportation, and then Brent messaged me, and I kind of did a little bit of a joke and said, well, they should be reforming our welfare or our social assistance.
Yeah, we did talk about that.
Okay.
So one subject at a time, right? Like these are all huge issues. And we talked about the urgency of deep legislated poverty and the political courage that we're not seeing to address that issue urgently, and we could be. But right now, what we were talking about, what I thought even we could do, like just some experiences people have with transportation around Canada. If you're in a federal jurisdiction for transportation right now under the Accessible Canada Act, the Canadian Transportation Agency has set up the guidelines that you have to have an accessible transportation planning and reporting. and they have regulations now for it. And so we were kind of talking a little bit about that. In a nutshell, we're saying that federal jurisdiction, transportation providers, like think of airports, think of the trains, planes, and the stations that provide the services, and the CBSA, they have to have their accessibility plans in place by the end of this year, so December 2022. And if you are privately owned, think of Air Canada, Via Rail, they have to have them in place by June of next year. And these accessibility plans, they have to be these initial plans that they have to make public, and every 3 years they have to update them. And in the meantime, they have to share every year progress reports, and those progress reports have to include the feedback that they get from people. So from now on, whenever any of us have a negative experience related to accessibility issues, they are required to confirm that they received the feedback. It has to be in their report, and they also have to report on how they're addressing the issue. So we were talking a little bit about the ways that people can communicate, give their feedback. If a transportation service provider is on a social media platform, they have to accept the complaint or the concern or the feedback, if you will. They have to accept it in that platform as well. And it's got to go in their reports. So this is all new. This is going to be rolling out, but it sort of fleshes out an idea for us of what's going to be contained in these progress reports, right?
That sounds really super positive, actually. But here again is where you can kind of see how the income assistance would be related to that, because as we all know, at least here in BC, I mean, you're severely punished if you leave the province and go on a holiday, say for over a month. You know, for if you're 30 days out of the province, you get a big slap on the wrist. So when we talk about freedom to travel and freedom for transportation, that's not really true, because the social assistance system has a whole bunch of things you have to jump through, and they really kind of keep you cemented down, you know, that you actually don't have the freedom to move. So I do think it's important that both things get addressed at the, you know, and I guess they won't both get addressed at the same time, but I'm just saying it is a connected issue, right? They're both connected.
Oh yeah, it's all connected for sure. Yeah, I don't know what are some of the immediate issues that people have with regard to transportation. I know affordability is a huge issue for so many people, and people living with disabilities are in deep poverty right now, and that's the height of frustration that is not being dealt with. But in terms of accessibility plans for transportation service agencies, like, I don't know what everyone's experience is, but we were talking a little bit about, even Neil was talking about when he had traveled into the United States, you see a big difference because they have real teeth in their ADA.
Oh, yeah, it's huge, the difference on how the U.S. deals with the accessibility and people with disabilities there compared to in Canada. Like, it's so much change needs to happen, and I mean, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of great developments, and it's exciting news. Like, that's really good that we're moving forward and getting that streamlined. And like you mentioned earlier, Cheryl, it's if we can just get an intern, somehow they have to get an intern amount put in place to help people getting through the legislated poverty, so they're not suffering while they work on the legislation and all the implementations.